The first test. The baby hits the floor, not dropped, placed. The midwife lays the newborn on the cold stone at the father's feet and steps back. The room goes silent. The mother, still bleeding on the birthing bed, watches her husband's face. He could bend down and lift the child, or he could turn and walk away. This is tollere liberos, the acceptance. And until it happens, this infant has no name, no rights, and no guarantee of living past the next hour. In Rome, fathers held the power to decide whether their newborn children lived or died, a practice that continued until the 1st century CE. The father reaches down, lifts the child. It survives, for now. But here's the thing most people miss about Roman childhood. Getting picked up by your father was just the first of many tests. 1 in 3 Roman children died before their first birthday. Disease moved through cramped urban homes like fire through dry wood. Contaminated water, bad food, no concept of infection control. Studies estimate 300 infant deaths for every 1,000 live births. 3 out of 10 gone before they could walk. So what happened to the ones who survived that first brutal year? What did their days actually look like? The answer depends entirely on one thing: whether your father was the man lifting you off the floor or whether someone else did. The naming. For 8 days, if you're a girl, 9 if you're a boy, you exist in a strange limbo. No name, no legal status, just a breathing thing that might not make it to next week. Roman families deliberately waited to name their children because so many died in the first days of life. The dies lustricus finally arrives, the day of purification and naming. Family gathers, slaves bring small gifts, silver trinkets, ivory hands, tiny axes carved from bone. These aren't toys, they're charms, protection against the evil eye and the malignant forces that kill children in their cribs. Your father hangs the bulla around your neck, a gold pendant if he's wealthy, a leather knot if he's not. You'll wear it until you become an adult, assuming you live that long. The ceremony ends. You have a name now. But naming you doesn't mean keeping you, because here's what the history books skip. Historians estimate that 20 to 40% of all babies were abandoned during the later Roman Empire. 20 to 40% left in known public locations, clothed and decorated with identifying tokens, waiting to see if someone would take them home. Most were picked up. Some became beloved adopted children, others became slaves, some ended up in brothels. Families left infants at well-known spots around the city, and at least some proportion were saved to be raised as slaves or prostitutes. The ones who died, they were never counted, never commemorated. Babies younger than 40 days were usually buried instead of cremated, and often placed under houses or within city walls, because they weren't considered developed enough to affect Roman religion. You survived the exposure period, you have your bulla, you're one of the lucky ones. Now the real test begins. The education divide. Age 7 arrives. The alarm goes off at 6 in the morning, except there are no alarms, just the noise of the city waking up, carts rattling, vendors shouting, the smell of bread baking in the insula downstairs. If your father is wealthy, a slave escorts you to the ludus literarius, the school of letters. School started around 6 in the morning and finished just after midday. You carry wax tablets, a stylus, a sponge for erasing, all tucked in a small case called a theca. The teacher sits in a large chair. You sit on a backless stool with your tablet balanced on your knees. There were no school desks, no individual attention. Students of different ages crammed into the same room, each approaching the teacher separately to recite memorized passages. Get something wrong? 2 slaves hold you down while the tutor beats you with a leather whip. This isn't abuse, it's pedagogy. Fear makes you learn faster, or so they believe. But most Roman children never saw the inside of a ludus. If your father is poor, age 7 means something different. You wake up at dawn and follow him to the fields or the workshop. You learn his trade because it will be your trade. There's no teacher, no wax tablet, just your hands, his tools, and the understanding that if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you're a slave child, slave traffickers preyed on neglected children old enough to be out alone, luring them with sweets and toys. Some were deliberately raised for prostitution. Others were maimed to make them more pitiable as beggars. Some were sent to the ludus of a different kind, the gladiator school. Gladiator schools trained slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war, transforming them into skilled fighters for the arenas. Training began as early as the teen years for some. Most recruits were 18 to 20, but younger boys were not unheard of. They learned to fight, to entertain, to die. The education divide wasn't just about knowledge. It was about whether you learned to read or learned to kill. If you want to see what happened during the brief moments Roman children actually got to be children, and discover the brutal practice that determined which babies never got the chance to grow up at all, hit that like button and subscribe, because every single like and subscription helps the channel a lot. Thank you, and let's continue with their daily lives. Daily routine. Breakfast is bread, maybe fruit if your family has money, salted porridge if they don't. Then the day splits based on your gender and class. Wealthy boys, morning lessons with tutors, memorizing poetry, studying rhetoric, learning to speak like senators even though most of them will never enter the Senate. Wealthy girls, staying home, watching their mothers manage slaves, learning to run a household because that's what they'll do in 4 or 5 years when they marry. Poor boys, working alongside their fathers, hauling water, carrying grain, apprenticing in trades that will consume the rest of their lives. Poor girls, helping their mothers. Girls were only taught to read and write, then trained in household chores because they would eventually grow up to manage homes, cooking, spinning, weaving, all the invisible labor that kept Rome functioning. But there were brief moments, stolen time between work and sleep, when Roman children actually got to be children. They flew kites, rolled metal hoops that chimed like bells. Boys played war games with wooden swords, practicing for a future that required them to think like soldiers. Girls played with dolls, rag dolls for the poor, jointed ivory dolls for the rich. They played knucklebones, an ancient gambling game using small animal bones. They raced toy chariots pulled by mice. They played hide and seek and blind man's bluff and games that looked like primitive versions of baseball. The phrase nucis relinquere, to leave the walnuts behind, meant abandoning childhood. Roman children played gambling games with nuts, and the phrase about leaving walnuts became a metaphor for entering adulthood. For most Roman children, those moments of play were brief. Sunset meant more work, more chores, more preparation for a life that demanded everything and promised very little. The toys got put away, the hoops stopped rolling, and childhood, what little there was of it, kept ticking toward its inevitable end. The exposure practice. Let's talk about what happened to the children who weren't lifted off the floor. The Christian writer Tertullian attacked Romans for exposing infants to cold, hunger, and wild beasts, or drowning them. The practice was so common it had its own locations, specific spots in Rome where unwanted babies were left on display. The Latin word expositio meant offering up or putting out, more like an exposition than abandonment. Parents clothed the infants, added trinkets that could identify them later. Some even waited nearby to see who would take their child. But let's be clear about what this really meant. Yes, some exposed children were rescued by childless couples who desperately wanted a family. Some were picked up by wealthy households looking for slaves who could be trained from infancy. But many others died of exposure, died of starvation, died because no one came. The reasons for exposure were complicated. Poverty, yes, but also shame. Children born from rape, from adultery, from incestuous unions that couldn't be acknowledged. Evil omens sometimes led to exposure as well, such as when Germanicus died and many parents refused to acknowledge their newly born children. and deformity. Cicero stated that deformed infants should be killed, and Romulus had decreed that no child could be killed before age 3 unless deformed. If your baby was born with a cleft palate, a twisted limb, or any visible defect, the 12 tables of Roman law required the father to expose it. But here's the part that shows just how disposable Roman children were. Until the 1st century CE, fathers could legally kill their own children without consequence, even after accepting them into the family. Not exposure, not abandonment, direct killing, legal under Roman law. The practice was criticized. Philosophers condemned it. Early Christians called it barbaric. But it was so deeply embedded in Roman society that changing it took centuries. Most exposed infants disappeared into history without a trace. Some became the slaves you passed on the street. Others became the names scratched into catacomb walls. Stercorious, which doesn't mean abandoned in the garbage. It means little shit. That was the value Roman society placed on unwanted children, a name that meant refuse. The transition. Childhood in Rome didn't fade. It ended. For girls, the end came around age 12 to 14. One day you're playing with your ivory doll, dressing it in miniature togas and pretending it's a senator's wife. The next day, your mother takes the doll away. When girls reached marriageable age, they removed their bulla and set aside their toys before putting on the white bridal tunic and flame-coloured veil. No gradual transition, no teenage years. Just a ceremony that stripped away your childhood and replaced it with a husband you might have met once, a household you'd now manage, and the expectation that you'd start producing children of your own. Children who had a 1 in 3 chance of dying before age 1. For boys, the transition happened around 15 or 16, the toga virilis ceremony. You removed your bulla and the toga with the purple stripe you'd worn since childhood. Your father and male relatives escorted you to the forum. You put on the plain white toga of a Roman citizen. The ceremony marked the transition from boy to man, complete with household sacrifice and placement of the name into family records. From this moment forward, you were expected to think like a citizen, act like a soldier, and carry the weight of Rome's future on your shoulders. No room for mistakes, no time to figure things out. You were a child, now you're an adult. Perform accordingly. The system didn't care if you were ready. It needed bodies, workers, soldiers, mothers. So it took children and transformed them through ritual into functional adults, regardless of whether they'd actually grown up. Because here's what Rome understood that we often forget. Childhood is a luxury, and luxuries only exist when survival isn't constantly in question. The numbers. Let's close with the reality that every Roman parent lived with but rarely spoke about. More than 1 in 3 children died before their first birthday. If they made it past 1 year, approximately 30% died by age 6. Infant mortality was almost 400 per 1,000 births in some estimates, meaning that despite high fertility rates, only about 3 children survived to age 5 in an average family. And it wasn't just children dying. For every 1,000 live births, 25 mothers died during or shortly after childbirth. This meant Roman women needed to have 5 or 6 children just to maintain the population. Fertility rates had to be high to counteract mortality rates. Every pregnancy was a gamble with death. Every infant represented potential loss. A study of 18th century Bavaria found that married women had an average of 5.6 children and watched almost 3 of them die before age 15. Roman families likely faced similar or worse odds. Fronto, the tutor of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, wrote about losing 5 children, each death occurring while he mourned another. That wasn't unusual, that was just life. The system worked because it had to. Rome needed soldiers for endless wars, workers for massive construction projects, citizens to maintain the empire. So it produced children in vast numbers, knowing most wouldn't survive, and treated the ones who did as replaceable parts in a machine that ground forward regardless of individual suffering. Roman childhood wasn't a time of innocence and play. It was a sorting mechanism, a biological lottery, and the winners, the ones who made it to adulthood, spent the rest of their lives trying to produce enough children to keep the system running. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy videos like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and see you in the next one.